Genesis 6 through 8 describes a year-long global flood, a judgment initiated by God against general human evil that catastrophically killed most land animals and people, as well as significantly changing the Earth's surface. For several reasons, Enlightenment secularists wanted to discredit the biblical flood story. First, the flood was a major judgment by God, and these guys wanted to eliminate God and anything he was involved with, especially human accountability and judgment. They were categorically opposed to any supernatural intervention into history, creation, judgment, predictive prophecy, and the Messiah Jesus. Second, their imagined paradigm was focused on natural processes alone, making small, incremental changes at a uniform rate over deep time. Thus, if you can calculate how much material originally filled what is now a canyon, and then measure the amount of material eroded over a year, simple division will tell you how many years it took to erode the canyon to its present depth, and, hence, its age. Unaware of plate tectonics, and willing to ignore known evidence of varying rates of change and catastrophic events in Earth history, European secularists were anxious for a story of Earth history that eliminated even the possibility of the flood described in Genesis. So James Hutton and Charles Lyell became famous, even the fathers of modern geology, for devising an Earth history myth in which there were no major catastrophic extinction-level events and rates of change were gradual and uniform over time. Instead, normal non-catastrophic processes like weathering and erosion slowly carved canyons and valleys at a uniform rate, sand grain by sand grain, over deep time. Lyell provided a long, gradual, slowly changing Earth history story without interruptions, upon which Charles Darwin could imagine a similar story for life's diversity.
With the guidance of Lyell's book, Darwin could make out an astonishing story.
Interestingly, some have admitted that discrediting the biblical story was central to the development of the new story of Earth history.
The most important responsibilities of the geologists involved the effect of their findings on the mental and spiritual lives of mankind. Early geologists fought to free people from the myths of biblical creation. Many millions still live in mental bondage, controlled by ignorant ranters who accept the Bible as the last word in science.
The main force of this proposition was to eliminate supernatural explanations of material phenomena, for this uniformity denies divine intervention, the suspension of natural laws. Methodological uniformitarianism was useful only when science was debating the status of the supernatural in its realm.
How do you discredit the idea of a worldwide watery catastrophe? Simple. You just downplay and eliminate all major catastrophic events from Earth history and assert that gradual processes operating over deep time at uniform and unchanging rates could produce all of the features of the Earth's surface. The present is the key to the past. James Hutton imagined uninterrupted gradualism and asserted that Earth history had gone through many cycles, but all had occurred by gradual processes operating over deep time without interruption by any major catastrophe.
In The Economy of the World, said Hutton in 1795, I can find no traces of a beginning, nor prospect of an end. On this declaration has been built much of the modern science of geology.
Archibald Geikie, John Playfair, and Charles Lyell would later portray Hutton as a great early geologist battling against ignorant biblical mythology. Charles Lyell grew up with an interest in entomology, botany, and then geology, but by profession he was a lawyer. He adopted Hutton's views, added some ideas, and worked out his own timescale for Earth history. Lyle, as a forceful courtroom persuader, promoted Hutton as a great geologist whose insights had been rejected by blinded academic catastrophists who still believed in the biblical flood and refused to face facts. Lyle, in turn, was later promoted by others as a great geologist, and the story spread. Thus, the present is the key to the past, and what is seen occurring now, processes and rates of change, can be extrapolated to explain Earth history. Uniformitarian belief in an ancient, slowly changing Earth would eventually become the foundational assumption upon which modern geology is built.
Uniformitarianism is the cornerstone on which the science of geology is erected.
It remained for another Briton, Charles Lyell, to synthesize a theory, uniformitarianism, from the growing avalanche of evidence. Thus, if one assumes the passage of immense amounts of time, this will explain the presence of such diverse strata as exist in the Earth's crust. Lyell established the idea of evolution as the only reasonable interpretation of geological facts, and his elaboration of Hutton's doctrines still constitute the very foundation of geologic science.
Along with uniform gradual rates of change, another foundational assumption for uniformitarianism came from the earlier work of Nicholas Steno, who argued that strata normally form as gravity deposits sediments from the waters above, which is called superposition. This would mean that the lowest strata are the oldest, and remains of any life forms contained in them must be older than those in the strata above them. William Smith developed geological stratigraphy, using index fossils, assumed to belong only in certain strata, to help identify strata some distance apart. Assuming uniformitarianism and superposition to be true, the assumed chronological accumulation of strata worldwide was portrayed in the geologic column. It was gradually assembled from the study of many local rock systems by a number of researchers: George Christian Fuchsel, Giovanni Arduino, James Hutton, Abraham Gottlob Werner, George Cuvier, William Buckland, Adam Sedgwick, and Charles Lyell. Uniformitarian geology was devised to support the Enlightenment's philosophical agenda, but it has always been false for the following reasons. Its founders were not great scientists. Geological features are produced by gradual processes and also catastrophic events. Gradual process rates are not always uniform over time, and extinction-level events have occurred. As appealing as geological uniformitarianism has always been to those eager to discredit the biblical timescale and flood, the late Stephen Jay Gould noted that the story portraying Hutton and Lyell as great geologists battling close-minded academic biblical catastrophists is pure fiction. Those academics were more knowledgeable and honest about evidence for catastrophic events in Earth history, which Hutton and Lyell wanted to ignore. Derek Egger has asserted that sudden catastrophic events do change the landscape more in a short time than gradual processes do over a lengthy period of time.
In fact, the catastrophists were much more empirically minded than Lyell. The geologic record does seem to record catastrophes: rocks are fractured and contorted, whole faunas are wiped out. To circumvent this literal appearance, Lyell imposed his imagination upon the evidence. The catastrophists were the hard-nosed empiricists of their day, not the blinded theological apologists.
The hurricane, the flood, or the tsunami may do more in an hour, or a day, than the ordinary processes of nature have achieved in 1,000 years.
Lyell's zeal to promote his ideological story caused him to ignore contradictory evidence. Niagara Falls had eroded its way up the Niagara River 35,000 feet from the Queenston Bluffs, and Lyell thought this would be a good example of his story. He assumed the falls were 35,000 years old, and that would mean about a foot of erosion each year. He visited the falls in 1841, but local residents told him that the erosion was around 3 feet per year, with huge chunks breaking loose at times. That would reduce its age to 10,000 years or less. So he rejected their testimony and kept his own figures. Annual measurements after this revealed the falls to be eroding 4 to 5 feet per year, which would bring the age down to 7 to 9,000 years. A similar error occurred in Lyell's dating of the Weald, an eroded wide valley in Britain, with Lyell placing its age at around 300 million years, which modern geologists would reduce by 80% to 60 million. By the early 1900s, Lyell's uniformitarian doctrine had become geological dogma, and to doubt or question it made one a heretic, an outcast in the scientific community. The prevailing belief was that mountains and other features were caused by the continued cooling and shrinking of the Earth. In 1926, the meteorologist Alfred Wegener presented his views on what came to be known as continental drift and plate tectonics, but his views were ridiculed by uniformitarian geologists who dismissed him as not being a geologist and uninformed. Also in the 1920s, Joseph Pardee and Harlan Bretz, both with the U.S. Geological Survey, recognized by observation that the scablands of the American Northwest appeared to have been carved rapidly by catastrophic flooding. However, like Wegener, their interpretation was opposed for decades by dogmatic uniformitarian higher-ups in the U.S. Geological Service, who refused to even consider that catastrophic flooding could have had anything to do with major geological formations. However, by the 1960s, enough evidence had accumulated that Wegener's plate tectonics theory was accepted and quickly became the new orthodoxy, and now to doubt it would cause you to be dismissed as geologically uninformed. Pardee and Bretz's interpretation of the channeled scablands was vindicated as the results of the catastrophic Missoula glacial flood. Current geologists wonder how the flood explanation could have been rejected for so long, but the answer is simple. This was a case of evidence eventually overcoming entrenched ideology, for popular ideologies can attain dogma and orthodoxy status in secular academia just as much as in religious institutions. The geologic column was assembled upon the assumption of uniformitarianism and superposition, but was primarily assembled from a number of European rock systems, and there are some sizable anomalies in alleged overthrusts and areas where layers are missing. Apparently, when strata are found in this order, they rarely have the assumed thicknesses. The problem with superposition is that there is now experimental evidence that strata can form sideways, from water moving over the surface of the land, picking up and depositing different sizes of sedimentary material depending on the speed of the water flow. This might better explain certain features of the fossil record and such phenomena as polystratic fossil trees. These are trees that are found to extend upright through numerous strata. Uniformitarians assert that strata formed separately under warm, shallow seas over long periods of time, or that these trees were buried upright by river floods. The problem is that even trees living in a shallow ocean would not live long enough for 10 feet of strata to slowly build up around them, and trees impacted by river flooding are not found upright, surrounded by sediments, but are washed downriver and jammed together horizontally. However, an intact, healthy tree could stand, while successive flows of sediment-rich water deposit strata horizontally over a much shorter period, from rising daily tidal surges as floodwaters gradually encroached further onto a continent. Some appear to have been uprooted and then deposited upright elsewhere. We have been reminded in recent years of the reality and destructive power of tsunamis in Indonesia and Japan. In fact, researchers are again beginning to recognize the evidence of catastrophic flooding and tsunamis in the past all over the world. 8,000 years ago, Mount Etna erupted, sending a tsunami 80 feet high across the Mediterranean Sea. 7,000 years ago, a major flood impacted the entire Mediterranean region as the Black Sea suddenly dumped a massive amount of water and flooded a large area. The area known today as the English Channel was once an inhabited land called Doggerland, which was overwhelmed with water and eroded by a massive tsunami 7,000 years ago. 4,800 years ago, a massive tsunami wave 600 feet high hit Madagascar, leaving a large formation called a chevron. The ancient city of Helike on the Corinthian Gulf suddenly disappeared from sight in 373 BC. Modern researchers found it under 15 feet of mud, catastrophically buried in one night by liquefaction, a landslide, and then a tsunami wave. Mountains are assumed to have formed very slowly, either as volcanic domes grew with successive eruptions, or as tectonic plates collided with one plate thrusting upwards as the other plates slid underneath.
Geological formations, such as mountain ranges and the Grand Canyon, require millions of years to form, and the fossil record extends over several billion years.
However, while current beliefs hold that the Appalachian Mountains, Russian Urals, North American Rockies, as well as mountains in Himalayas, the Andes, and the Swiss Alps are given dates in the tens of hundreds of millions of years, researchers continue to differ on these figures, sometimes by wide margins.
New discoveries changed the prevailing thought over the last 2 decades, and the high range of the Andes is now considered to be about a third that of previously accepted age. The Andes are vastly younger than we had thought.
Coal is believed to have formed very slowly as swamps and peat bogs slowly grew in depth and eventually were covered with more sediments, in a very slow process taking millions of years.
The decomposition of organic matter to petroleum is known to require millions of years.
Evolutionists assign coal formation to 2 major periods, the Carboniferous and Permian eras, 350 to 250 million years ago, and a later period during the Cretaceous and Tertiary periods, from 135 to 2.5 million years ago. However, peat beds are filled with root structures, but coal often contains large amounts of tree bark. Research has now demonstrated that under the right conditions, plant material, water, pressure, and heat, both coal and oil can be produced in a fairly short time. One of the arguments for an old Earth has been the size and apparent age of coral reefs, which are asserted to grow at a very slow and steady rate. However, research has found that coral reefs can grow at various speeds, as well as grow for a while, turn off, and then start growing again later. Canyon systems were assumed to have been carved out very slowly at a uniform rate by non-catastrophic processes, one sand grain at a time. However, that story is changing. The Hudson River Valley was probably cut fairly rapidly by glacial melt flooding from Canada. The 1980 volcanic eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington state provided a laboratory for catastrophism. The explosive eruption changed the landscape for miles around. Hundreds of feet of stratified deposits were produced rapidly, Then a subsequent mud flow breached an earthen dam and rapidly produced a canyon system. And all of this was observed to have occurred in sudden catastrophic events within a decade or so, not slow and gradual processes operating over long periods of time. Canyon Lake Gorge in Texas formed over the space of a weekend in 2002, when a large amount of water was released from a reservoir. Although it was farmland during the Civil War, the Providence Canyon system near Lumpkin, Georgia, has developed from erosion since the 1860s. Rather than taking a long time to form and then develop vegetation, researchers have observed the sudden creation of volcanic islands. One island near Iceland, called Surtsey, developed very rapidly from a volcanic eruption between 1963 and 67, with features and vegetation developing within a few years that would have otherwise been assumed to require long periods of time. Glaciers do not move at a steady, uniform rate, but are now known to move at different speeds depending on temperature and the lubricating meltwater underneath. In 1986, the Hubbard Glacier in Alaska was measured moving at times between 46 and 112 feet per day. We know from observation that earthquakes and landslides can relocate a large amount of material in a very short time. In 2015, a large crack opened up in the area of the Wyoming Bighorn Mountains. It was not caused by erosion, but local ranchers reported it soon after its appearance. Geological and biological uniformitarianism are also false because, rather than uninterrupted gradualism, evolutionists now identify at least 5 cataclysmic events in which large numbers of life forms were suddenly wiped out. As far as species made extinct, 85%, 75%, 96% of marine life, 70% of terrestrial life, 80%, and 75%. In 1965, Stephen Jay Gould published an article that openly raised what was rapidly becoming a very significant question: is uniformitarianism necessary? He noted that the idea of assuming uniform rates in natural processes was appealing because it eliminated supernatural intervention, and if rates and processes are assumed to be uniform through time, then it is easy to explain and calculate an age for geological phenomena. The problem is, we know by observation that this is not the case. Gould admitted that discrediting the biblical view and removing it from academic discussion was perhaps the major contribution of uniformitarianism. Having accomplished its goal, uniformitarianism should now be retired because the evidences for catastrophic events in Earth history, which geologists were aware of before uniformitarianism became dogma, are still there and are being recognized again.
Methodological uniformitarianism was useful only when science was debating the status of the supernatural in its realm. Their battle has been won, and the weapon which secured the victory deserves to be honorably retired, lest it appear like the crossbow in a nuclear age.
He also noted that uniformitarian dogma has stood in the way of geological research for some time.
For more than a century, many geologists have been stifled, the range of their hypotheses falsely channeled and restricted, by a belief that proper method includes an a priori commitment to gradual change.
In 1971, Edgar Heilman published an article echoing Gould's position, arguing that uniformitarianism should be dropped because it does not represent the data of the real world.
The fact is, the doctrine of uniformitarianism is no more proved than some of the early ideas of worldwide cataclysms have been disproved. There are simply too many uncertainties developing in the geological sciences to continue teaching the doctrine of uniformitarianism in the classical manner.
After exposing the flaws in uniformitarianism in his 1965 article, Gould began to do the same to its founders. Catastrophes in Steady-State Earth, published in 1975, unmasked Lyle as a persuasive lawyer, misrepresenting his opponents and evidence to sell his story. As we noted in the previous section, the academic catastrophists that rejected Hutton and Lyell's scenario were not ignorant men blinded by adherence to Genesis, but did so because they were aware of the evidences for great cataclysmic events in the past that neither Hutton nor Lyle wanted to see. If anyone was blinded by ideology, it was Hutton and Lyle. In the same 1975 article, Gould accused Lyle of playing fast and loose with evidence, offering a hodgepodge of claims as though it was a new and better view of Earth history, and asserting things that were contrary to all available evidence. Gould followed that up in 1987 with a similar lengthy expose on James Hutton, entitled Time Zero, Time Cycle, Myth and Metaphor in the Discovery of Geologic Time.
Hutton was never considered a major figure by continental geologists. Lyell's vision demanded a hero as empiricist. Hutton was pressed into service, in one of the most flagrant mischaracterizations ever perpetrated by the heroic tradition in the history of science.
After reading all three articles, I came away with the feeling that uniformitarian geology is another erroneous mythology that was imagined to discredit the Bible and promote the Enlightenment agenda. Its founders were not the elite scientists that people were led to believe they were.
Contrary to popular myths, Darwin and Lyell were not the heroes of true science.
This problem was noted by the Canadian geologist E.G. Nisbet, working in the area of early Earth history. He expressed his frustration with uniformitarianism because it did not seem to fit what he was seeing in the rocks.
Even the assumption of uniformity, the principle that the workings of the modern Earth can be used as a guide to the past, so basic to modern geology, is suspect. It is the business of the archaeogeologist to remain skeptical of the over-rigid application of uniformity, and perhaps to attempt to restore those words to their proper place. First, there is the problem of the infrequent event, the meteorite impact, the volcanic explosion, or the catastrophic flood. These are actualistic events. They happen today, but they are rare and are poorly understood. In the Archean, their frequency may have been much greater, and the geological consequences correspondingly different.
And with the Bible now removed from the discussion of nature, researchers are again recognizing evidence of catastrophic events and processes that are not nearly as uniform as evolutionists wanted to believe. Contrary to the doctrine of uninterrupted gradual uniformity, some researchers believe there is evidence that early storms and their impact upon the Earth's surface was much greater than that seen today. Why was a narrative of uninterrupted gradual uniform change in Earth history developed and continues to be promoted when knowledgeable experts before and now know that simply is not true? The problem is cultural ideologies that are more interested in advancing their own agenda than honestly following evidence towards the best understanding of nature. The Enlightenment had a clear agenda: to discredit the biblical story of creation, life, and the Great Flood by contradicting it at every possible point and replacing it with materialistic, naturalistic, gradual evolutionary development stories, in which there was no room or need for God. The nebular hypothesis portrayed the early Earth as covered with hot magma, not water. Uniformitarian geology described an old, gradually changing Earth without any catastrophic interruptions, especially flooding. Darwin suggested that the origin of life came from inanimate matter by natural processes alone, the gradual transformation of protozoa into all major groups, and humans descended from the great apes. Hegel and Marx offered evolutionary development stories for human history. These stories formed what came to be viewed as a monolithic fortress of secular scientific orthodoxy, but without eyes of faith, they increasingly look like a massive house of cards. Features in nature do appear to have been intelligently designed. Evidence suggests that the universe appeared from nothing, with a general curse of decay and decline. The early Earth was covered with water before the continents appeared. Catastrophic flooding and extinction-level events have occurred in Earth history. As we noted in the previous video, committed atheists have embraced and promote the Enlightenment worldview as the only possible explanation for nature, and themselves as the only authentic spokesman for science. However, as John Lennox has pointed out, rather than the science coming first and leading to the worldview, it is increasingly clear that with the Enlightenment, the materialistic naturalism worldview came first and was then used to retool science to support their philosophical agenda. And rather than evidence speaking for itself, evidence in the realm of science is usually interpreted on the basis of a presumed paradigm or worldview as a guide for understanding. This becomes easy to see when scientists credentialed in the same area and looking at the same evidence come to very different conclusions. It is even more obvious when men who are not experts in cosmology, astrophysics, or geology make bold assertions about the Earth and universe. In 1957, a book was published expressing the views of the famous atheistic philosopher Bertrand Russell. In one lecture, he said this about the world.
There is no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause. Nor, on the other hand, is there any reason why it should not have always existed. There is no reason to suppose that the world had a beginning at all. The idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination.
Along the same lines, in 1995, the famous atheistic biologist Richard Dawkins made the following comment about the universe.
The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
Russell and Dawkins were avowed atheists who were speaking far outside their fields, so it is reasonable to think that their philosophical commitments played a major role in shaping their views. On the other hand, Arno Allan Panzias is an American physicist, radio astronomer, and Nobel laureate in physics. Along with Robert Woodrow Wilson, he discovered the cosmic microwave background radiation, which helped establish the Big Bang theory of cosmology. So Panzias was speaking very much within his area of expertise when he said the following.
The best data we have concerning the Big Bang are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole.
If you want to understand the origin and history of the universe and Earth, while sketchy and leaving lots of room for further research to fill in the details, Genesis is still a pretty good place to start.